A black soldier returns home, but 7 minutes later, everything changes. A black soldier, fresh from deployment, finally steps into the airport, ready to reunite with his family. But just as he begins his journey home, everything takes a turn he never expected. A security officer spots him. No crime, no suspicion, just a decision made in a split second. The officer questions him, demands his ID, and when the soldier asks why, the situation escalates. Humiliated in front of stunned onlookers, he is treated like a suspect instead of a man who has served his country. But then, just 7 minutes later, something happens that no one saw coming. The officer, so sure of his authority, is fired on the spot. What led to this shocking turn of events? Who stood up? And how did the truth come to light so quickly? Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from today. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It was just ordinary. Sergeant David Carter had never been one for grand homecomings. He had seen too much, lost too much, to believe in the simple, clean-cut stories they liked to tell about men like him. About war heroes stepping off planes into the waiting arms of grateful families. Flags waving, strangers clapping, as if everything could be neatly packaged into a moment of triumphant return. But war does not end with a flight home. And home is not always the place you left behind. The airport was the same as it had always been. A polished world of fluorescent lights, sterile hallways, and the ever-present murmur of travelers moving towards someplace else. David moved through it quietly, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his military uniform marking him as both someone to admire and someone to ignore. People's eyes flickered toward him, then away. Some offered polite nods, others, businessmen, mothers herding children, young couples whispering to each other, pretended he wasn't there. That was how it always was. For some, he was a symbol. For others, an afterthought. But in a country he had bled for, he had never truly belonged. He reached the gate, the weight of the past year still pressing into his shoulders. The heat, the sand, the missions that went sideways, the ones that didn't make the news. And now, after all of it, just a flight home. He glanced at his boarding pass. First class. That part surprised him. He wasn't the kind to expect upgrades, to feel entitled to luxury. Maybe the airline had done it out of respect. Or maybe some unseen hand had pushed a button somewhere. Either way, he wasn't going to question it. For once, he would take the seat. For once, he would let himself rest. The gate agent called for first-class passengers to board. David waited, letting the others go ahead. He had spent years moving carefully, knowing that people expected certain things from a man who looked like him. When the line thinned, he finally stepped forward, handed over his ticket. The agent scanned it, nodded. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant." David gave a polite nod in return. No need for small talk. No need for a moment. He just wanted to sit down. The jet bridge was quiet, the hum of engines growing louder with each step. And then, the cabin, rows of wide, leather seats, soft lighting, the quiet rustle of newspapers, the clink of ice against glass. A world apart from the cramped, noisy flights he had taken before. David walked down the aisle, scanning the seat numbers. 2A. And that was when it happened. That pause. That stare. A flight attendant, neatly dressed, professional, stepped forward, eyes scanning him. Not his seat. Not his ticket. Him. It was a small moment. A hesitation. A second too long. But David knew what it meant. And just like that, the battlefield shifted. She cleared her throat, schooling her face back into a polite smile. "Excuse me, sir," she said, voice even, controlled. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Not rude, not angry, just enough doubt to make it clear that he was not expected here. David had faced worse. Commanders who saw his rank before they saw his skill. Civilians who thanked him for his service but still crossed the street when they saw him in civilian clothes. It was always the same. The assumption, the expectation, the unspoken belief that a man like him, a black man in America, no matter the medals on his chest, Could not possibly have earned his place here. David exhaled slowly, keeping his voice calm. I've got a first-class ticket, he said, holding it out. She took it, barely glanced at it, and yet, she hesitated. That hesitation meant everything. That hesitation was a lifetime. A quiet way of saying, "Are you sure?" A quiet way of saying, "You don't belong here." David had spent years in places where every moment was a fight for survival. And yet, somehow, it was these moments, these small, civilized humiliations, that cut the deepest. He had been taught that war had clear rules. But here, at home, the battlefield was everywhere, and the rules were never spoken aloud. Sergeant David Carter had learned long ago that there were two sets of rules in America. The first was written down. The laws, the codes, the policies, the rules that told him he had rights. That his service mattered, that he belonged as much as any other man. The second was unspoken, but it was the one that shaped the world he moved through. The second was the one that made people pause when they saw him in places they did not expect. And now, here, at Seat 2A, the weight of that second rule hung between him and the flight attendant, lingering in the air like the last words of an argument no one had spoken aloud. She was still holding his boarding pass. Still hesitating. Still making that small, careful calculation. The one that told David exactly what she was thinking. How did you get here? The pause stretched long enough for nearby passengers to notice. A man in a suit frowned behind his newspaper. A woman with diamond earrings glanced over, then quickly looked away. The world had not stopped. But it had shifted. David knew this shift. He had felt it in restaurants, in hotel lobbies, in offices where men in pressed shirts had smiled too tightly when he walked in. He had felt it as a child, when his father had taught him how to not be a problem in public places. And now, he felt it here, on a plane that had not yet left the ground. "I'm sorry, sir," the flight attendant said finally. Her voice smooth, controlled. "It seems like there's been a mix-up. You might want to check with the gate agent." David had seen men respond to moments like this in different ways. Some got angry. Some laughed it off. Some, tired, exhausted, simply turned and walked away. But David had spent too many years following orders. Too many years knowing when to stand his ground and when to let things slide. He had fought too hard. Lost too much. To let this pass without a fight. He did belong here. And this woman, this stranger, who knew nothing of the miles he had marched, the weight he had carried, the men he had pulled from the fire, was about to find that out. "This is my seat," he said evenly, his voice carrying just enough weight to remind her that he was not a man who needed permission. The flight attendant blinked, recalibrating. She had not expected pushback. She had expected him to shrink, to defer, to accept the question as reasonable. She had expected compliance. But David Carter had spent years learning how to fight battles he hadn't chosen. And he was fighting this one. "Sir," she tried again, softer now, aware that people were listening. Aware that the rules had shifted. That the moment had gotten away from her. But before she could finish, another voice cut in. A deep, measured voice from a few rows back. "Sergeant Carter?" David turned. A man was rising from his seat. Straight-backed, wearing a crisp navy suit. And suddenly, the battlefield shifted again, because this man knew his name. The voice that had spoken his name did not waver. It cut through the thick, unspoken tension that had settled over the cabin. It was a voice used to being listened to, used to command, but it carried something else. Something David Carter recognized immediately. Authority. David turned. The man who had spoken was standing now, stepping into the aisle with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years expecting the world to make room for him. His suit was crisp, well-fitted, but it did little to disguise the posture of a man who had worn a uniform before. Colonel Raymond Wallace. David knew that name, had served under it, had fought in a war where names like Wallace's had meant something, had decided whether men lived or died. And now, here, thousands of miles from any battlefield, that name had stopped a different kind of war from unfolding. The flight attendant, still holding David's boarding pass, turned toward Wallace. Her expression flickered. Confusion, hesitation, Calculation. She had expected this moment to belong only to her and David. She had not expected someone else to enter the fray. She had not expected witnesses. Because moments like this, these quiet, polite denials, these unspoken refusals, were never meant to be seen. They were meant to pass. They were meant to be absorbed in silence. But now, silence was no longer an option. Sergeant Carter, Wallace repeated, his tone sharp, deliberate. Didn't expect to see you here, son. David nodded, feeling the weight of the moment shift. Likewise, sir. Wallace turned to the flight attendant. Is there a problem here? The words were not an accusation. Not yet. But they were a warning. The flight attendant straightened. No problem at all, she said too quickly. There was just a mix-up with the seating. Quote. There's no mix-up, Wallace interrupted, his voice dangerously calm. Sergeant Carter's name is on that ticket. That seat belongs to him. The moment stretched thin. Passengers who had tried to remain indifferent were watching now. Some with quiet curiosity, others with something closer to recognition. Because they knew what this was. They had seen this script before. They had seen men like David stopped in places they had every right to be. They had seen the pauses, the hesitations, the unspoken questions wrapped in politeness. They had seen how the world had been built for some, and monitored for others. And now, they were seeing something else. Something crack. The flight attendant, now fully aware of the eyes on her, adjusted her expression. This was just a misunderstanding, she said, softer now, like she had never meant to be a problem. Like he had been the one who had overreacted. David exhaled slowly. He had seen this maneuver before. The shift from denial to dismissal. I don't believe you belong here. Let's pretend this never happened. From resistance to avoidance. Because the truth of it, the unspoken, ugly truth, was that she had never expected to be challenged. She had never expected to be forced to see herself. David took his ticket from her hands. Slow, deliberate. Then, without a word, he sat down in his seat. The flight attendant hesitated for just a moment longer, as if considering whether to say something more. Then she turned, disappearing down the aisle, her retreat silent but undeniable. Wallace watched her go, then turned back to David. Been a long time since I had to fight a battle in first class, he muttered. David gave a small, tired smirk. Funny, I feel like I've been fighting this one my whole life. Wallace nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. And as the plane prepared for takeoff, the weight of that understanding settled over the cabin. Heavy, lingering, and impossible to ignore. The plane had not yet left the ground. But Sergeant David Carter felt as though he were still in combat. Not the kind fought in the deserts he had left behind. Not the kind where bullets decided the winners and the dead. But the kind that had followed him home. The kind that had never ended. The war of perception. The battle to be seen as what he was, rather than what the world had already decided he must be. He had won this round. Claimed his seat. Asserted his right to exist here without question. But the victory was a hollow one. Because the battlefield was bigger than this plane. And the rules had never been fair to begin with. The flight attendant had not returned. She had fled down the aisle. Her retreat careful but obvious. The kind of retreat that people with power take when they are forced to see themselves in a way they do not like. The kind of retreat that says, I didn't mean anything by it. The kind that makes the offender the victim. The wronged party. Because she had simply done what had felt natural. To question. To doubt. To place herself as the gatekeeper. And now that her assumption had been challenged. Now that she had been made to feel something close to discomfort. She had removed herself. Meanwhile, David was still here. Still carrying it. Colonel Wallace had returned to his seat. But his presence lingered. David could feel the gravity of the moment settling into the cabin. The weight of something that had almost gone unnoticed. Almost been allowed to pass as just another mistake. But mistakes like this were never just mistakes. They were patterns. They were habits. They were the quiet, everyday moments that shaped the lives of men like David. Unremarkable to those who did not have to endure them. But exhausting for those who did. And the exhaustion was creeping in now. Not the exhaustion of deployment. Not the exhaustion of combat. But the exhaustion of knowing. Knowing that this would not be the last time. knowing that tomorrow, next week, next year, another man who looked like him would step into a space where he was not expected. And the same pause would happen. The same hesitation. The same unspoken challenge. And maybe, next time, there would be no Colonel Wallace to step in. Maybe, next time, the pause would turn into something worse. Maybe, next time, the rules would shift against him. The murmur of the passengers had softened, but David could still feel them watching. Not openly, not with malice, but with awareness. Because they had witnessed it. Because they had seen the rules flicker. If only for a moment. And for some, that was enough to make them uncomfortable. The suited businessman across the aisle was still pretending to read his paper. But he hadn't turned a page in 5 minutes. The woman 2 rows ahead, diamond earrings catching the light, had glanced at David more than once. Her expression caught between curiosity and something else. Recognition. David wondered if she had seen her own hesitation in that flight attendant's face. If she had ever asked the same silent question to another man in another place. If she was thinking, even now, about the ways the world had been arranged in her favor without her ever needing to notice. And that was the thing about moments like this. They revealed themselves only to those who could afford to ignore them. For David, the revelation had come a long time ago. For everyone else, it was new. The flight intercom crackled, breaking the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We are cleared for takeoff. David closed his eyes as the plane rolled forward. He exhaled slowly, feeling the force of acceleration press him back into his seat. The ground fell away beneath them. And yet, David knew that when they landed, when this plane touched down in another city, in another space where he would have to prove himself again, the fight would begin all over again. The plane had left the ground. But the weight of the moment remained. David Carter sat still, his back pressed against the seat. His breath measured. The engines hummed. The city beneath him grew smaller. And yet the battlefield had not disappeared. It had simply changed altitude. He had been trained to adapt. To move through hostile terrain without hesitation. But what kind of training prepared a man for this? For a country that needed him to fight its wars but questioned him in its first-class cabins? For people who would call him a hero when he was in uniform but a threat when he was in plain clothes? For a nation that both claimed him and refused him in the same breath? The flight attendant had returned. Though she did not meet his eyes. She moved through the aisle, offering water, wine, and orange juice. Her hands were steady, her voice even. She had recalibrated. But David knew that she was not just serving drinks. She was reclaiming control, resetting the moment, trying to smooth over what had already been set in motion. Because that was how it always worked. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a quiet, practiced erasure, an attempt to make it seem as though nothing had happened at all. David let her pass. He had no interest in easing her discomfort. He had been carrying this kind of discomfort his whole life. A voice spoke from across the aisle. You handled that well, Sergeant. David turned slightly, his eyes meeting Colonel Wallace's. The older man had a glass of scotch in his hand. His expression unreadable. David gave a small nod. Did what I had to do. Wallace studied him for a moment. Then exhaled slowly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. You know, he said, his voice lower now, as if weighing each word. This country has always been good at asking men like you to prove themselves. David knew what he meant. He thought of his father, who had fought in Vietnam, only to come home and be refused service at a diner in his own hometown. He thought of his grandfather, who had worn a uniform in World War II, but had been told his GI Bill didn't count the same way as it did for white soldiers. He thought of the long, unbroken line of men who had fought for America while America made them fight for their place in it. I stopped proving myself a long time ago, David said finally. Wallace gave a knowing nod. Smart man. Then he leaned back in his seat, taking a slow sip of his drink. I'd like to tell you it gets easier. David didn't need to hear the rest of the sentence. Because he already knew the truth. It didn't get easier. It only got quieter. The questions wouldn't stop. The pauses wouldn't stop. The doubt wouldn't stop. But the world would learn how to hide it better. And that, in many ways, was more dangerous than the hate they had fought against in the past. Because it was harder to fight something that did not announce itself. David let his head rest against the seat, staring at the ceiling, feeling the hum of the engines beneath his skin. The country he had fought for was beneath him now, its borders stretching far beyond what he could see. And somewhere down there, men like him, black men in first-class seats, in boardrooms, in offices, in patrol cars, in courtrooms, were still being asked to prove that they belonged. The battle had never ended. The air was just thinner up here. The flight had settled into its rhythm. The hum of the engines, the low murmur of conversation, the quiet clinking of ice against glass, all of it working together to create the illusion of calm. But David Carter knew better. Because calm was not the absence of tension. It was just the ability to ignore it. And the people on this plane, these businessmen, these vacationers, these weary travelers, had chosen to ignore what had just happened. The moment had passed. The air had smoothed. And yet, for David, the turbulence remained. A flight attendant passed by, offering wine. Not the one from earlier. Another one. She smiled at him. Polite. Professional. Would you like a drink, sir? David studied her. She didn't hesitate. Didn't pause. Didn't calculate the way the other had. Because, to her, this was just a transaction. Because she had not been part of the moment. And that was what struck David most. The selective awareness of it all. How one person could move through this space without the weight of the past few minutes pressing against their chest. While he would carry it for the rest of the flight. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. He declined the drink with a small shake of his head, turning his gaze back toward the aisle. The flight attendant from earlier, the one who had questioned him, was standing near the galley now, speaking to another crew member in hushed tones. She didn't glance his way. Didn't acknowledge him. She had moved on. Because she had that luxury. David exhaled, slow and measured. Men like him were never allowed to move on so easily. Colonel Wallace stirred in his seat. David didn't turn his head. But he could feel the older man watching him. You're thinking about it, Wallace muttered. David gave a short, tired laugh. I don't have a choice. Wallace nodded, taking a sip of his drink. You'll find that's one of the rules. Sergeant. David finally turned to him. What rules? Wallace leaned back, resting his glass on the armrest. The ones they never write down. But expect you to follow anyway. David said nothing. Because he already knew. He had been following them his whole life. He had known the rule that said his uniform would be respected. But only while he was wearing it. The rule that said he would fight for his country. But not always be welcome in its first-class seats. The rule that said people would praise him for his service but hesitate to let him buy a house in their neighborhood. The rule that had told his father to keep his hands visible during traffic stops. The rule that had told his grandfather that fighting for America didn't mean he could sit at any lunch counter he wanted when he got home. And now, here, at 35,000 feet, the rules had followed him. Even here, above the clouds, far from the streets, far from the history books, they still applied. Wallace sighed, rubbing a hand over his chin. The hardest thing, Carter, is knowing when to let it go. David's jaw tightened. And when do you let it go, sir? Wallace didn't answer immediately. He just stared ahead, at the seat back in front of him, as if seeing something far beyond it. Then, finally, he said, I'll let you know when I figure it out. David leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. The hum of the plane continued. The drinks were poured. The conversations resumed. For the rest of them, the world had returned to normal. But David knew. It had never been normal for him. And it never would be. David Carter kept his eyes closed. But sleep never came. The plane had reached cruising altitude. Steady and smooth. But inside, his mind was still moving. Restless. Because this was the part no one ever talked about. Not the moments of direct confrontation. Not the blatant acts of prejudice that people could point to and say, that was wrong. But the aftershocks. The quiet, unseen weight a man carried long after the moment had passed. The knowledge that he would remember this. But no one else would. Across the aisle, Colonel Wallace had stopped speaking. His breathing slow. His drink half finished, David glanced at him, at the relaxed posture of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. David wondered how long it took for that to happen. How many years? How many small humiliations? How much quiet endurance before a man stopped expecting the world to be any different? Because that was the danger. Not rage, not resentment, but acceptance. The kind that crept in slowly, convincing you that this was simply the way things were, the way they would always be. That silence was safer, that not pushing back was easier. The flight attendant reappeared, moving through the aisle with quiet efficiency. She still did not look at him. Not once. Because to look at him would mean acknowledging what had happened. Would mean admitting, even for a second, that she had played a part in something bigger than a mistake. But David had seen this before. The rewriting of moments. How history could be erased in real time. Turned into something else. Something more comfortable for the people who had caused harm. By the time this flight landed, she would have convinced herself that nothing had happened at all. And that was the difference. She would forget this moment. David never could. A few rows ahead, a man leaned slightly toward the aisle. Casting a glance back, David met his eyes for half a second. The man looked away. He had seen. He had heard. But he had chosen, like so many before him, to say nothing. That was another truth about America. One that David had learned as a boy watching his father navigate the world. The worst moments didn't happen when people were against you. They happened when people who knew better said nothing at all. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our descent into Chicago soon. We should be on the ground in about 30 minutes. David exhaled. This flight would end. He would step off this plane. Feel the rush of airport air. Move through the terminal. And eventually this would become just another story. Not the worst. Not the first. Not the last. Just one more. And that was the true exhaustion. Not the fight itself. But knowing there would always be another one. The ground was getting closer. But David Carter was still falling. The plane tilted slightly forward, beginning its slow descent toward Chicago. The lights of the city stretched below. Vast and indifferent. A constellation of streets and stories that had been written long before this flight. Before this moment. Before David Carter ever existed. He had spent years learning how to navigate the distance between where he came from and where he was expected to go. Between what was promised and what was given. Between belonging and being tolerated. And here he was again. Caught between two places. Not fully on the ground. Not fully in the sky. Just suspended in the space where men like him had always been forced to live. Colonel Wallace stirred beside him, adjusting his seat as the flight attendants made their final rounds. David watched as the woman, the same one who had questioned his presence in first class, moved carefully through the cabin. She avoided his gaze. She was still rewriting the story in real time. Still convincing herself that what had happened was nothing more than an unfortunate miscommunication. And soon, when she told the story to herself, then to others, it would shrink even further. Until, eventually, it had never happened at all. David knew this kind of forgetting. He had seen it before. The way the world erased its discomfort. The way it rearranged history to protect the people who had done the harm, rather than those who had endured it. The way black soldiers had returned from war, only to be denied housing, jobs, dignity, while the nation they fought for pretended it had always treated them as equals. The way his father had taught him to stand tall in his uniform, knowing that it would not always protect him. The way every man before him had learned to carry the weight of what America would not admit to itself. And now, as the plane dipped lower, as the city grew closer, as the moment began to fade into memory, David knew he was carrying it too. The landing gear unfolded with a dull mechanical hum. The wheels hit the ground, the force of it pressing him back into his seat. It was over. And yet, it wasn't. Because the fight never ended. Because the war was never just on the battlefield. Because a uniform could not protect a man from the things America refused to change. The plane slowed, taxiing toward the gate. Passengers unbuckled their belts, stretching, adjusting their jackets, shifting back into their own lives. For them, this had been just another flight. For David, it had been a reminder. A lesson he had already learned too many times. That some battles are fought in silence. That some wounds don't bleed. But they never heal. That the hardest war is the one that never officially begins. Because the country refuses to admit it is happening at all. The door to the cabin opened, and the first-class passengers began to file out. David stood, grabbing his bag, moving toward the aisle. The flight attendant was standing near the exit. Her expression carefully neutral. She gave a polite nod. "Have a good evening, sir." Her voice was smooth, professional. She had found her way out of the moment. David stepped forward, pausing for just a second. Then, he looked her in the eye. And he said nothing. Because she already knew. Because she would remember this moment. Even if she never admitted it aloud. Because some truths do not need to be spoken to be heard. The cold air of the airport terminal hit him as he stepped off the jet bridge. He let out a slow breath. And then he walked forward. Into a country that still had not decided what to do with men like him.